February 28, 1944. Royal Air Force, Debden, England. 40 miles north of London, the pre-dawn darkness carries the distinctive roar of Packard Merlin engines warming up on the flight line. But these aren't Spitfires. These are P-51D Mustangs, freshly delivered and still smelling of factory paint. Most of the pilots climbing into their cockpits have never flown this aircraft before, not once, not even a familiarization flight around the field. Standing beside the lead aircraft is a 26-year-old lieutenant colonel with ice in his veins and fire in his eyes. His name is Donald James Matthew Blakeslee, and he's just made a promise to his commanding general that should terrify every man on this flight line. He promised that his pilots would have these brand-new fighters operational within 24 hours of receiving them. He promised they'd be combat-ready by morning. And when General William Kepner asked how pilots could possibly learn to fly a new aircraft type, that quickly, Blakeslee's answer was simple and absolutely insane. Learn how to fly them on the way to the target. 4 days from now, these same pilots will escort B-17 flying fortresses over Berlin. It will be the first time single-engine fighters have made the 1,100-mile round trip to the German capital. The mission will change the air war over Europe forever. It will mark the beginning of the end for the Luftwaffe, and it will prove that one man's unshakable belief in an aircraft could transform strategic bombing from a death sentence into a war-winning weapon. This is not the story of how technology defeated Germany. This is the story of how a former Royal Canadian Air Force pilot who joined the fight before America entered the war turned a good fighter plane into the Luftwaffe's worst nightmare. This is the story of how aggressive leadership, tactical brilliance, and absolute faith in his aircraft and men allowed Don Blakeslee to do what no one thought possible: take the air war to Germany's doorstep and never look back. The North American P-51 Mustang was never supposed to be a high-altitude escort fighter. When the prototype first flew on October 26, 1940, it was designed to meet a British requirement for a fast, low-level fighter bomber. Powered by an Allison V1710 engine producing around 1,000 horsepower, the early Mustang was exceptional below 15,000 feet. It could reach 386 miles per hour at that altitude, faster than almost anything flying at the time. The British loved it for ground attack and tactical reconnaissance missions. But above 20,000 feet, where the big bombers fought their battles, the Allison-powered Mustang was a disappointment. The engine's single-stage supercharger simply couldn't compress enough air at high altitude to maintain power. At 25,000 feet, where Luftwaffe fighters prowled the bomber streams, the early Mustang was outmatched, outrun, and outclimbed by the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf 190. The Royal Air Force had an idea. What if they replaced that sea-level optimized Allison engine with something designed for high altitude? What if they installed a Rolls-Royce Merlin 61, the same two-stage, two-speed supercharged engine that powered the legendary Spitfire? In October 1942, Rolls-Royce engineers in England completed the first conversion, designated the Mustang X. The results were extraordinary. The aircraft could suddenly reach over 440 miles per hour at 28,000 feet. Its service ceiling jumped to 42,000 feet. It climbed like a rocket. It handled beautifully at altitude, and most importantly, it maintained the Mustang's exceptional range. Across the Atlantic, North American Aviation was watching. They began their own conversion program using Packard-built versions of the Merlin engine. The Packard V1657 produced 1,490 horsepower at 3,000 revolutions per minute, and with war emergency power could push 1,720 horsepower. By June 1943, P-51Bs were rolling off the production line at Inglewood, California, each one powered by a Packard Merlin and equipped with 4 50-caliber Browning machine guns in the wings. The new Merlin-powered Mustang had spectacular performance, but what made it revolutionary was fuel capacity. The P-51B carried 184 gallons internally. With an 85-gallon fuselage tank added behind the pilot and two 108-gallon drop tanks under the wings, a Mustang could carry 401 gallons of fuel. At economical cruise settings, burning around 60 gallons per hour, that gave the P-51 7 hours of endurance. 7 hours. Enough to fly from England to Berlin and back with combat time over the target. No other fighter in the world could do that. Not the P-47 Thunderbolt, which even with drop tanks struggled to reach 600 miles. Not the P-38 Lightning, which was chronically unreliable in the cold European skies and suffered catastrophic failures of its Allison engines at high altitude. Not the Spitfire, magnificent as it was, which was fundamentally a short-range interceptor. The P-51B Mustang could go anywhere the bombers went and stay with them the entire time. But in late 1943, as the first P-51Bs arrived in England, they weren't going to the 8th Air Force's experienced fighter groups. They were going to new units assigned to the 9th Air Force, designated for tactical operations. The Pentagon, in its infinite bureaucratic wisdom, had classified the Merlin Mustang as a tactical fighter because earlier Allison-powered Mustangs had been used for ground attack. Never mind that the new version was completely different. Never mind that the 8th Air Force was bleeding to death over Germany because no fighter could protect the bombers all the way to the target. Policy was policy. One man refused to accept that policy. His name was Don Blakeslee, and by December 1943 he'd been fighting the Luftwaffe longer than almost any other American pilot alive. Donald James Matthew Blakeslee was born September 11, 1917, in Fairport Harbor, Ohio. As a boy, he watched the Cleveland National Air Races held just 30 miles from his home, mesmerized by the speed, the sound, the sheer audacity of pilots pushing machines to their absolute limits. He knew, even then, that flying was what he was meant to do. In 1938, 21 years old and working at the Diamond Alkali Chemical Plant, Blakeslee saved enough money to buy a Piper J3 Cub with a friend. They joined a flying school, trading instruction time for the use of their aircraft. Blakeslee loved flying, but had no money for a career in aviation. When his friend crashed the Cub in 1940, Blakeslee made a decision that would define the rest of his life. In October 1940, he crossed the border into Canada and joined the Royal Canadian Air Force. America wasn't at war yet. The Battle of Britain was raging, and Blakeslee wanted to fight. He completed pilot training and was sent to England in January 1941, where he was assigned to No. 401 Squadron of the Royal Air Force, flying Spitfires. He was good, very good. He earned a Distinguished Flying Cross and accumulated combat hours rapidly. In June 1942, he transferred to No. 133 Squadron, one of 3 RAF Eagle squadrons composed of American volunteer pilots. He was promoted to squadron leader by August. When King George VI visited the Eagle squadrons to present decorations, Blakeslee stood before the king and received the Distinguished Flying Cross from the monarch's own hand. By September 1942, the Eagle squadrons had proven themselves repeatedly. The RAF had 3 squadrons of experienced American fighter pilots, and the United States Army Air Forces needed them desperately. On September 12th, the 3 Eagle squadrons were transferred to American command and became the 334, 335, and 336 fighter squadrons of the 4th Fighter Group, 8th Fighter Command. Blakeslee was given command of the 335 Squadron with the rank of captain. He'd flown Spitfires for over 240 combat hours. He understood air combat at a level few pilots ever reach. And he had an unshakable understanding that fighter pilot aggressiveness wins battles. Defend bombers by shooting down attacking fighters? Yes, but better to destroy the enemy before he gets to the bombers. Better still to catch him on the ground. Best of all, make the enemy so afraid of your appearance that he stops coming up to fight at all. The 4th Fighter Group was initially equipped with Spitfires, painting United States Army Air Force's stars over the Royal Air Force roundels. Later, they transitioned to P-47 Thunderbolts. Blakeslee hated the P-47. It was a magnificent aircraft in many ways, robust and powerful, with 850 caliber guns and the ability to absorb tremendous battle damage. But it was heavy. It lacked range, and to Blakeslee it felt like flying a bathtub compared to the nimble Spitfire. By January 1944, Blakeslee had been promoted to lieutenant colonel and given command of the entire 4th Fighter Group. He was 26 years old. His message to his pilots was simple and direct. "We are here to destroy the Luftwaffe and shoot the Germans out of the sky, and that's what we're going to do." But first, he needed better aircraft. He needed P-51 Mustangs. In December 1943, Blakeslee was temporarily assigned to the 354 Fighter Group, the first unit to receive Merlin-powered Mustangs, to help introduce the aircraft to combat operations. He flew the P-51B for the first time and instantly fell in love. Everything he wanted was right there: the speed of the Spitfire, the range he'd never had, visibility good enough for formation, flying, and combat maneuvering. Handling that was crisp and responsive at all altitudes, and most importantly, performance at high altitude that matched or exceeded anything the Luftwaffe could put in the air. Blakeslee returned to the 4th Fighter Group at the end of December with a singular obsession: get his pilots into Mustangs as soon as possible. He pushed General Kepner relentlessly. The 4th was one of the most experienced fighter groups in the theater. They'd been in combat since September 1942. They deserved the best equipment available, but Kepner resisted. The official policy was to equip new fighter groups with Mustangs. Experienced groups would keep their P-47s because transitioning to a new aircraft type took time. Pilots needed ground school, familiarization flights, training missions. Converting an entire group would take weeks, maybe months. The 4th would be non-operational during that time. Blakeslee made a promise: "Give me the aircraft and my pilots will be operational in 24 hours. Kepner thought he was crazy. Blakeslee told him, "We'll learn how to fly them on the way to the target." Kepner, knowing Blakeslee's reputation and recognizing the potential advantage, finally agreed. The 4th Fighter Group received their P-51B Mustangs on February 28, 1944. Blakeslee kept his word. On the morning of February 29th, the 4th flew their first combat mission in Mustangs. Some pilots took off with less than 1 hour of flight time in the new aircraft. They learned engine management, gun harmonization, fuel transfer procedures, and formation flying while heading into combat airspace. 4 days later, March 4th, the 4th Fighter Group escorted B-17s and B-24s to Berlin. It was the first time single-engine fighters had made the 1,100-mile round trip. The Luftwaffe appeared in force. Blakeslee's pilots accounted for multiple confirmed victories. More importantly, the bombers got through, dropped their ordnance, and returned home with acceptable losses. On March 6th, they did it again. This mission became the pivotal moment. 680 bombers attacked Berlin in daylight, protected by hundreds of fighters, many of them P-51 Mustangs. The Luftwaffe rose to defend their capital, and a massive air battle erupted over Germany. When the smoke cleared, American fighters claimed 75 enemy aircraft destroyed. The 8th Air Force lost 69 bombers, devastating losses, but the Luftwaffe lost 160 fighters, losses they could not replace. Don Blakeslee was officially credited as the first United States Army Air Force's pilot to fly over Berlin in a single-engine fighter. 2 days later, he was promoted to full colonel at age 26, but Blakeslee understood something most commanders didn't. Taking P-51s to Berlin was a tactical victory. Destroying the Luftwaffe was a strategic necessity, and the way to destroy the Luftwaffe wasn't to wait for them to attack the bombers. It was to hunt them down wherever they were. In early 1944, Major General James Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force. He made a critical decision. The primary mission of fighter escorts was no longer to stay with the bombers at all costs. The primary mission was to destroy German fighters. Anywhere, any time. On the ground, forming up, attacking bombers or fleeing combat. Hunt them. Destroy them. Make the Luftwaffe afraid to fly in their own airspace. Blakeslee embraced this doctrine with ferocious enthusiasm. He developed a tactical innovation that amazed everyone who saw it. During major bomber missions, Blakeslee would position his Mustang above the swirling air battles, circling at altitude while monitoring multiple radio frequencies. He'd watch the entire tactical situation unfold beneath him, tracking friendly formations, spotting enemy attacks developing, identifying opportunities. Then he'd broadcast directions to his squadrons, vectoring them toward targets, coordinating attacks, orchestrating the three-dimensional chess game of aerial combat from his vantage point above the battle. Pilots marveled at how he kept everything straight. Dozens of aircraft, multiple fights happening simultaneously, friendly and enemy formations merging and separating, all at speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour. Yet Blakeslee maintained situational awareness of the entire battlefield, directing his forces with precision that seemed superhuman. His personal approach to combat leadership was equally remarkable. He told his pilots, "I'm going to fly the tail off each one of you. Those who keep up with me, good. Those who don't, I don't want them." He led from the front, flew more missions than anyone, took the same risks he asked his pilots to take, and never asked for anything he wasn't willing to do himself. The results were extraordinary. In April 1944, the 4th Fighter Group's 336 Squadron claimed 26 enemy aircraft destroyed and 16 damaged in a single mission, the greatest score ever claimed by one squadron in United States Army Air Force's history. The 4th became the first fighter group in the European theater to reach 400 confirmed victories, then 500, then 600, then 700. They were relentless. By the end of April 1944, just 2 months after receiving P-51 Mustangs, the 4th Fighter Group had passed the 500 victory mark. The Luftwaffe was losing experienced pilots faster than they could be replaced. Aircraft production continued, even increased under the direction of Armaments Minister Albert Speer. But pilots take years to train, and the Luftwaffe no longer had years. They didn't even have months, and they certainly didn't have the fuel to train new pilots properly. The strategic bombing campaign, controversial for decades after the war, had found its winning formula. Not just bombing factories, though that continued. The real target was the Luftwaffe itself. Attack German oil production, force the Luftwaffe to defend, then destroy the defending fighters in air combat. Repeat until Germany has no fighters left. Then attack everything else without opposition. In January 1944, the Luftwaffe fighter forces wrote off 30.3% of their single-engine fighters. In February, 56%. The losses were catastrophic and unsustainable. By spring 1944, the Luftwaffe was fighting a losing war of attrition, and everyone knew it. The technical specifications tell part of the story. The P-51D, The definitive production model introduced in summer 1944 carried 650 caliber Browning machine guns with 1,840 total rounds. Each gun fired 850 rounds per minute. When all 6 guns fired simultaneously, the P-51D put 100 rounds per second into the air, at combat ranges of 200 to 300 yards, that created a cone of destruction that disintegrated anything caught in it. The Packard Merlin engine produced 1,490 horsepower at normal settings, 1,720 at war emergency power. With the 2-stage, 2-speed supercharger maintaining manifold pressure at altitude, the P-51D could reach 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. Its service ceiling was 41,900 feet. Rate of climb was 3,200 feet per minute. With drop tanks, operational range exceeded 1,650 nautical miles. Compare that to the Luftwaffe's primary fighters. The Messerschmitt Bf 109G could reach 398 miles per hour at 22,000 feet, but its endurance was less than 2 hours. The Focke-Wulf 190A could match the Mustang's speed at lower altitudes, but suffered at heights above 25,000 feet. Both German fighters were formidable, but they were designed for short-range interception over German territory, not extended combat against escorts that could stay in the fight for hours. The other critical factor was fuel quality. American aviation gasoline was 130 octane, later 130 over 150 octane, depending on the mixture ratio. This allowed higher manifold pressures and more aggressive engine settings without detonation. German aviation fuel quality degraded throughout the war as synthetic oil plants were bombed repeatedly. By late 1944, German fighters were operating on lower-octane fuel that limited their performance envelope. But specifications only explain capability. They don't explain why the 4th Fighter Group, under Blakeslee's command, became the highest-scoring American fighter group in Europe. They don't explain why German pilots began avoiding combat with P-51s whenever possible. They don't explain why, when Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, saw Mustangs over Berlin, he reportedly said, "I knew the jig was up." The answer was leadership. Aggressive, relentless, innovative leadership that understood one fundamental truth. In aerial combat, the side that attacks first, attacks decisively, and never stops attacking wins. On June 21, 1944, Don Blakeslee led 65 P-51 Mustangs on the first shuttle mission from England to Russia, escorting bombers across Poland and landing at Superiority airfield in Soviet territory. The mission covered over 1,470 miles and lasted more than 7 hours. It required navigation across unfamiliar territory using 19 charts crammed into Blakeslee's cockpit. They encountered adverse weather and enemy fighter opposition. Not a single bomber was lost while under Blakeslee's escort. The shuttle missions demonstrated the Mustang's extraordinary range and the 8th Air Force's ability to attack Germany from multiple directions. German defenders could no longer predict where attacks would come from or where fighters would return to base. The psychological impact was devastating. Throughout summer 1944, the 4th Fighter Group continued their rampage across German skies. They strafed airfields, destroying parked aircraft. They attacked transportation infrastructure. They provided close air support for ground forces after D-Day. They hunted down any Luftwaffe aircraft they could find, and they did it with a ferocity that made them legends. By September 1944, senior American commanders recognized that keeping pilots like Blakeslee in combat indefinitely was unsustainable. High-scoring aces were dying. Experienced leaders were being lost. Blakeslee was ordered to stand down from combat flying. He'd accumulated more combat missions and more combat hours than any other American fighter pilot of World War II, over 500 operational sorties, over 1,000 combat hours. He'd been wounded 9 times, earning 9 Purple Hearts. And he was still alive, still fighting, still wanting more. On November 19th, 1944, Don Blakeslee left the 4th Fighter Group. His official victory tally was 15.5 aerial victories and 2 ground victories. Many historians believe the actual number was significantly higher, as Blakeslee routinely gave credit for victories to junior pilots to boost their confidence and morale. He never painted victory markings on his aircraft. He never named his planes. He never sought publicity. He was there to destroy the Luftwaffe, nothing more. The numbers tell the strategic story. From January through May 1944, the Luftwaffe lost thousands of fighters and hundreds of irreplaceable, experienced pilots. By June 6, 1944, D-Day, Allied air superiority over Western Europe was absolute. The Luftwaffe managed only a handful of sorties against the invasion beaches. The greatest amphibious operation in military history, with thousands of ships and hundreds of thousands of troops exposed on open beaches, proceeded virtually unopposed from the air because the Luftwaffe had been defeated months earlier in the skies over Germany. The average monthly loss rate for 8th Air Force heavy bombers fell from 5.1% in 1943 to 1.9% in 1944. Bomber crews who had faced 77% casualty rates in 1942 and 1943 suddenly had a 74% probability of surviving a 30-mission combat tour. The difference was fighter escort that could stay with them all the way to the target and back. By the end of the war, the 4th Fighter Group under Blakeslee's leadership had destroyed over 1,000 enemy aircraft, both in the air and on the ground. They were the highest-scoring American fighter group in the European theater. 14 of the 8th Air Force's 15 fighter groups converted to P-51 Mustangs. Only the 56th Fighter Group retained their P-47 Thunderbolts, a decision based partly on pride in their established combat record. Over 15,500 P-51 Mustangs were produced during World War II. They served in every theater, with distinction, in dozens of air forces around the world. But it was in the skies over Germany, escorting heavy bombers to targets the Luftwaffe couldn't ignore, that the Mustang defined its legacy. Don Blakeslee retired from the United States Air Force in 1965 with the rank of colonel. He'd served in Korea, commanding the 27th Fighter Escort Wing flying F-84 Thunderjets. He'd continued his commitment to combat aviation throughout the jet age, but he shunned publicity, avoided biographers, and refused to discuss his wartime accomplishments. His daughter later explained that he simply didn't want attention for doing what he considered his duty. He died September 3, 2008. 8 days before his 91st birthday. On September 18th, his ashes were interred at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. The 4th Fighter Wing conducted a flyover. The irony is profound and multi-layered. An aircraft designed as a low-level tactical fighter became the premier high-altitude escort fighter of the war. A pilot who joined a foreign air force before his own country entered the war became one of the most decorated American pilots in history. A fighter group composed of former Royal Air Force volunteers became the highest-scoring American fighter unit in Europe, and a man who sought no glory, who gave credit to others, who simply wanted to destroy the enemy as efficiently as possible, became the symbol of aggressive fighter leadership that defined an era. The P-51 Mustang didn't defeat the Luftwaffe alone. Strategic bombing, superior logistics, overwhelming industrial production, tactical innovation, and the courage of thousands of airmen all contributed. But the Mustang made it possible to take the fight directly to Germany's doorstep and keep it there until German air defenses collapsed. And Don Blakeslee showed everyone how to use that capability to maximum effect. The morning of February 28, 1944, when Blakeslee told his pilots they'd learn to fly the Mustang on the way to the target, he wasn't being reckless. He was being calculated. He understood his pilots were experienced combat veterans. He understood the Mustang's handling characteristics were benign and forgiving. He understood that the Luftwaffe wasn't going to wait for the 4th Fighter Group to complete a leisurely training program. And he understood that every day of delay meant more bombers lost, more air crews who never came home, more missions that failed because fighters couldn't reach the target area. So he took the risk. He bet his pilots' lives, his own reputation, and his group's combat effectiveness on his belief that experienced fighter pilots could transition to a new aircraft type quickly under pressure. He was right. Not because the P-51 was easy to fly, though it was easier than most, but because his pilots trusted him completely. When Don Blakeslee said they could do something, they believed him. When he led from the front, they followed. When he demanded excellence, they delivered. That's leadership, not speeches, not slogans painted on squadron walls, not bureaucratic policies about proper transition procedures. Leadership is understanding your people's capabilities, giving them the tools they need, removing obstacles in their path, and then trusting them to accomplish the mission. Blakeslee did all of that, and the result changed the air war. The Luftwaffe never recovered from the spring of 1944. They produced more fighters, but couldn't train pilots properly because fuel was scarce. They developed revolutionary jet fighters like the Me-262, but couldn't deploy them in sufficient numbers to matter. They fought bravely until the very end, but they fought a defensive war, a losing war. A war where Allied fighters dominated German skies so completely that by 1945 the Royal Air Force resumed daylight bombing operations for the first time since 1940. Don Blakeslee and the pilots of the 4th Fighter Group, flying P-51 Mustangs, helped make that happen. Not overnight, not in a single decisive battle, but through hundreds of missions, thousands of combat hours, relentless pressure that never let up, never gave the enemy time to recover, never accepted that today's victory was enough. The mission was to destroy the Luftwaffe. They destroyed the Luftwaffe. Mission accomplished. The P-51 Mustang was a great aircraft, arguably the finest piston-engine fighter ever built, but aircraft don't win wars. People do. People who understand the mission, who commit completely to accomplishing it, who refuse to accept limitations, who lead by example, and who never, ever quit. Don Blakeslee was that kind of person, and when the Luftwaffe saw Mustangs over Berlin, they weren't just seeing an aircraft, they were seeing the manifestation of his will, his aggression, his absolute determination to take the fight to the enemy and never look back. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and see you in the next one.